Okay, the last in the series from 75 Years of Marg was Readings on Painting, edited by Deepthi Khera and Yael Rice. Today we have Deepthi Khera, who will be doing the presentation. She's an associate professor of art history in the Department of Art History and Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. She earned her PhD in South Asian art history from Columbia University's Department of Art History and Archaeology in 2013. In 2012 to 13, she was a postgraduate research associate and lecturer at the South Asian Studies Council, Macmillan Center, Yale University. Her research interests include South Asian art, early modern history, cross-cultural studies, Indian painting, Mughal history, manuscript and early printed books, among others. I'd like to invite Deepthi on stage. Yeah.
Thank you, Marg and Mansi, for that introduction. Audible now, Varun? Yeah. And I thank everyone at IIC for their welcome to their institution, and Marg, everybody at Marg, for enabling this conversation on a new curriculum for the arts. On behalf of my co-editor for Readings on Painting, Yael Rice, and myself, I want to thank our editor, Marg editor, Naman Ahuja, for this opportunity to dive into this vast archive, as you've been learning. And we're grateful to since I'm going last, I think I speak on behalf of everyone, that I'm really grateful to the entire Marg team for realizing this complex project. It is no mean feat to produce something so thick and beautiful and within this prescribed limit of images, pages, words, and yet make it so affordable and accessible for students, scholars, and the broader audience. And I'm sure it's going to become even more accessible, as we've just learned. Yael Rice and I worked together on all aspects of shaping this volume after receiving the material from Marg that was, since we are talking about classifications, that was classified under 3 lists: pre-colonial paintings, colonial and company paintings, and folk, tribal, village, popular art. We embarked on a complex process of grappling with this archive of 300 plus articles. A peek into our spreadsheet that you see on the screen, complete with ratings on critical criteria, shows our collaborative process on selecting the articles, highlighting the historiography, finding how it related to the questions scholars and students were asking today, co-writing the introduction, and finally reading and commenting on each abstract and section introduction that we wrote individually. Since Yael Rice cannot be present today, here's a brief introduction to her. She specializes in the art and architecture of South Asia and Greater Iran, with a particular focus on manuscripts and other portable arts of the 15th through 18th centuries. Her recent book, The Brush of Insight, and numerous articles ask questions about who were the historical actors who collaborated to produce painted books and knowledge in Mughal Hindustan, and how do we track such making processes, something that is of real interest in this audience, and their historical perception. My research has explored painted artifacts and architecture emerging from Rajasthan and Gujarat and circulating across courtly and non-courtly circles, from bazaars to Jain libraries to colonial networks. I have asked how paintings and painters engaged aesthetic ideals and emotional registers to transform a community or people's relation to history, politics, and a place. I'm highlighting these because our interests were complementary, and besides research, our respective teaching drew us to this project. Our courses introduce South Asian painting traditions as diverse, deeply intertwined with regional and trans-regional histories of knowledge and their tactile experience, as well as their emotional and political work in relationship to architectural spaces and use of historical art. So we deployed the reader to think about how our field was and is taught in India, within the subcontinent and beyond, since we are teaching the United States currently. And to learn from Marg's focus of realizing scholarship, pedagogical objectives, and a broad readership alike, right? So in so much talk with especially undergraduate and graduate students today, where do they go to search on the net? What is public scholarship? Who is a public intellectual? Marg really allows you to think about that aspect of teaching and scholarship as well. So painting has been an overriding concern for the magazine ever since its founding in 1946. The inaugural issue significantly included the lawyer, collector, scholar Karl Khandalwala's article on paintings in the collection of a recently deceased Parsi businessman, bourgeois and treasury-wala. Khandalwala contextualized paintings from the Pahadi and Rajasthani regions in terms of their place and date of production and subject matter in his article. But his objectives were more than academic. He closed the article with a plea that the nation acquire the Treasury-wala collection, lest the masterpieces go to foreign museums just because we are too immersed in politics, close quote. The National Museum of India, New Delhi, acquired this collection in 1947, about 2 years before its formal inauguration. Thus commenced Marg's institutional impact on the study of paintings and their integration into projects of nation building. Marg's early coverage of painting traditions focused on identifying discrete schools defined by courts and places that were prominent centers of production and patronage in a region, also defined by dynasty, religion, and caste. This emphasis accorded within methodological conventions current in the discipline of art history between the late 1940s and early 1960s, a period when much scholarship focused on the study of artistic idioms through regional and ethnic frameworks. In the case of Marg, and you're seeing this early archive listed on the screen, it also spoke to the magazine's stated mission to help construct and educate the nation about its rich cultural diversity. During the early 1950s, many of the debates were around the relationship between courtly Rajasthani painting and imperial Mughal painting. The identification within a sectarian Hindu-Muslim framework for these two groups of paintings drew largely on Ananda Kumaraswamy's important 2-volume Rajput painting. Published in 1916, during the peak of anti-colonial and nationalist fervor, Kumaraswamy formulated the category of Rajput painting to fit within the European and Anglo-North American canon of art history. Of course, most of you in this room know that Kumaraswamy was writing as a curator of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And so he was really seeking to refute this characterization of Rajasthani paintings as unrealistic and unsophisticated, as he sought to delineate the classical and civilizational rules of Indian art to provide it the stature according to Greek art in the West. However, such attempts also classified Rajput painting in largely religious terms. Marg authors, active during the post-independence decade, sought to open up the colonial division of South Asia's past into chronological Hindu, Muslim, and British periods. They viewed the question of Rajput painting's origins, including its relationship to Mughal emperors' patronage of illustrated manuscripts such as the Ragamalas, which describe the entire garland of different musical notes, the epic Ramayana, in terms of the co-constitution of these historical worlds in Mughal Hindustan. And this was a very timely and pressing concern for them. Shaped by contexts of partition and the investment of contemporary art and politics in Indian secularisms, ideas about the Mughal synthesis of artistic forms and their production in multiple sites by multiple artists across India was what guided these 2-volume issues in the publishing of volume 11, 2 issues in 1958. Even though the majority of studies in the first decades of the publications concerned royal patronage, Marg gave centrality to folk and tribal painting traditions. You see some of them listed in that spreadsheet. Bishnu Dey's Folk Art of Bengal, published in 1947, Verrier Elvin's Sayora Pictographs, 1948, W.G. Archer's Methil Painting, 1949. These were all published in quick succession. In that pie chart that you see on the screen, in that black area that you see, that's the overall distribution of this category versus the early years when it's really in quick succession. So that's not a great distribution overall, but it gives you a sense. Picture Showman, Insights into the Narrative Tradition in Indian Art, published in 1998, edited by Jyotindra Jain, extended the emphasis on artistic agency to the study of non-courtly itinerant painter storytellers from Gujarat, Bengal, and the Deccan, that is the southern peninsula region. And so these several studies from 1990s questioned colonial and nationalist taxonomies of folk and classical painting traditions, including their association with village and city, which were part of the modes in which 20th century canon formation was proposed, often within Marg's pages itself. Marg's vast archive thus led us, Yael and me, to imagine a chitrashala, a painted room, or rather a full picture house in readings on painting. We ask our readers to imagine entering a fabulous chitrashala like the 17th century mural adorned rooms where the rulers of Bundi in Rajasthan enjoyed the pleasures of painting, music, and poetry in exclusive company. In our imaginary chitrashala, however, the limits of time and space are breached. Paintings dating across 15 centuries appear on the walls, on textiles, and in books. The structure itself resembles a villager's painted home and an indoor market in Kolkata, all at once. Maharajas, sultans, monks, and court painters mingle with professors of art history, architects, curators, and collectors. Design students as well. Accompanied by the sounds and scents of monsoon rains, patuas, the itinerant painters, storytellers, sing their tales and musicians play their rags. Everything and everyone is found here. The reader reveals a long and trailblazing journey, from early preoccupations with the political, religious, and cultural origins of style, to the more recent paintings as registers, to the more recent studies of paintings as registers of emotion, wonder, knowledge, and the art market. Thematic sections group articles and photo essays from across decades and regions. Brief introductions to each of the sections, like in the other readers, highlight pertinent historiography, landmark exhibitions, and recent scholarship. The emphasis on the mobility of painters, paintings, and painting practices challenge conventional boundaries, courtly versus folk, mythical versus historical, of course, Rajput versus Mughal, Hindu versus Muslim, colonial versus pre-colonial, and thus the overlap with the reader on modernism is something that we highlight both in the introduction and the initial spreads that are there, picking on the essays that are there in the first section of that reader. As we witness the violent erasures by Hindu nationalists of Muslim, Dalit, Adivasi, and Christian lives, alongside the annihilation of books and buildings, contextualizing the visibility of their paintings and histories in Marg over the past 75 years was something that we felt was very imperative. The transformative potential of artworks and art history to show and tell otherwise invisible stories invites you, hopefully, to approach painted worlds, key debates, and new methods in an exciting way. Now, I will take you through some of the highlights in each of these sections. Section 1 on patrons, politics, and place invites you to consider why studying the history of painting very often entails learning to distinguish between different painting styles, whether it's of the 16th century Mughal court or, say, the 18th, 19th century patuas of Murshidabad. It is one thing to identify styles of painting and another to establish who or what is responsible for the origins of artistic styles. And why do styles migrate and change? And were the distinctions between styles as scholars identify them today, often to organize their collections, meaningful to their historical makers and consumers? Yael Rice signals the importance of 18th century writings of the German art historian, archaeologist, and specialist of Greek antiquity, Johann Winckelmann. He outlined a stylistic periodization for ancient Greek art that followed a biological model, beginning with the fledgling or archaic stylistic phase, then progressing to an apex, a period of stagnation, and finally decline. The review essay by Hermann Goetz, that is reproduced here and on the screen, outlines a similar model of stylistic development for the wall paintings in the Buddhist caves at Ajanta. It follows a similar cyclical trajectory. Contributors to Marg imbued these kinds of debates across the years with much nuance by taking into account the causal role that a patron of one style of painting might have played in the origins of another. On the other hand, for Jyotindra Jain and Richard Blurton, the painting styles associated with the patas, the painted narrative scrolls of Garuda in Gujarat and Murshidabad in West Bengal, were respectively delimited for their consumers by the mobile patua's acts of storytelling with the scrolls, that who is the one who makes these styles legible or identifies their breaches. By the late 1960s, as art historians began to treat painters, Mughal and otherwise, as agents in their own right, B.N. Goswami's groundbreaking Pahari painting, The Family as the Basis of Style, from 1968 to be precise, is reproduced as an excerpt in this reader. It introduced artists and artist genealogies compiled in the Gotra Bahis at Hardwar as important sources for the study of art history. Other Marg volumes, part of the initiative of the magazine of the institution to publish 4 thematic books each year since the 1970s, contributed significantly to expanding our knowledge of artists as interpreters of painting. You're seeing some of these books highlighted on the screen. These publications brought new subjects of inquiry, new geographies, new archives to the fore. The intellectual excitement discerned in these pioneering assessments is palpable. For instance, I have highlighted there for you the first thematic book in the Marg, in the Marg archive is Mulk Raj Anand's Persian painting in the 14th and 15th century. It was within one such volume that Sarayu Doshi examined, quote, the Islamic elements in Jain manuscript illustration, close quote, the title of her essay, which maps the shift from palm leaf to paper supports within the context of painters' encounters with Persian manuscript painting. Section 2, Agency and Knowledge of Painters, shows that painting styles arise and transform as a result of multiple factors that are in large part external to the physical making and makers of art. The fixation on a very small subset of apparently exceptional makers remained operative within the larger discipline of art history during the late 20th and the early 21st century, not just within the context of South Asian art history, but even beyond. And that is the time when studies by Ashok Kumar Das and Andrew Topsfield of the well-known painters Mansoor and Sahibdeen were published. These studies reproduced here did the important work of creating a canon of South Asian painters, Muslim and Hindu alike, on par with Europe's. But we also problematize this by including Qamar Adamji's study of the 15th century Northern Indian Chandayan manuscript and her work on looking at the modes in which its illustrators interpret the Hindavi text. So she is studying now anonymous painters of the manuscript, and this is published in 2016. So how do you think of artistic agency then? It is standard practice in art history to provide information about the place and date of a painting's creation. Yet many paintings, especially those that were easily portable, which was the case with several Indian paintings, circulated beyond their sites of initial creation. John Seiler's essay on the so-called Princes of the House of Timur painting in the section on the mobility of paintings studies how this artwork was repainted and altered later. Roger Goper's 1996 study of 11th to 13th century murals located in the Buddhist monastery of Alchi shows how artists from Kashmir brought their own unique painting styles, compositions, and iconography to this corner of the Ladakh region. Robert Skelton explains in an article published in Marg in 1959 that two different painters, one who had emigrated to Mandu from Shiraz, Iran, and the other a local one from central India, were responsible for creating the 50 extant illustrations in the Nimmatnama, an illustrated recipe book produced for the Khalji sultans around the end of the 15th, early 16th century. Indira Peterson, you also see that page on the screen, tracks the adaptation of the European portraiture genre in the 18th century Maratha courts, not as a celebratory multiculturalism, but as a calculated political act. Yael Rice thus notes in her section introduction, quote, "Paintings and painting genres do not merely move, they are instead deployed," close quote. Paintings create space, highlights how immersive painted interiors transform their extended built environment into exceptional and powerful sites. From the 5th century rock-cut sites of Ajanta and Sigiriya to the 17th and 18th century forted palaces of Mughal Hindustan and the 20th century mud or lime plaster homes of Madhubani, such works created awe-inspiring spaces for the performance of penance, worship, and pleasurable pursuits. Images painted on the thresholds of entrances, tiered ceilings, and plastered walls not only amplified the affective potential and spatial experience of architecture layered with art, but also held for the patron and their audiences a range of associations, whether commemorative, political, religious, or cosmic. Traditionally, manuscripts and paintings made on paper and palm leaf, housed in museums and private collections, dominate the history of painting, with the exception of Ajanta, of course. Marg's archive is rewarding in this regard. Essays devoted to wall and floor painting traditions made by women, Dalits, and Adivasis extend imaginaries of how painting created space in non-elite homes. Pupul Jaikar's 1978 essay on Varli pictographs highlights the drawings of the artist Jivya Somamarshe, propelling his works from walls to canvases, which became the basis for the artist's prospective exhibition at Mumbai's Gallery Kemold. This was in 1982. The essay was published in 1978. Modernism and modernity emerge as a thread in consideration of painted spaces in expected and unexpected ways. The Chitra Sutras, signs of painting, written during the 5th and 9th century, studied extensively by my colleague Parul Dave Mukherjee, prescribed that painters choose distinct moods for adorning rooms in homes, temples, and palaces, and also ensure that the selected space was, quote, spotlessly plastered, spacious, free from insects, bright, very pleasant, and secluded, close quote. This conception remarkably combines the concerns of artists, art historians, and conservators alike. Just as accounts of painting in motion are limited, texts barely describe how paintings delighted, moved, and motivated beholders. Pleasure, wonder, and emotion tracks modes of response and reception in the early modern period between the 15th and 18th century, while problematizing colonial and oriental frameworks that have hindered critical studies of pre-colonial aesthetics and knowledge that was constituted in paintings. Conversations about the perception, power, and politics of painted images call for an understanding of the period eye, or rather the period sensorium that animated them. Michael Baxendale, who taught at the Warburg Institute in London between 1965 to 1980, a time of fervent debate on finding new methods that went beyond dating and attribution, argued for looking at art through the embodied eyes of the period's viewers. Around the same time, What is Painting? Was published in the 100th issue of Marg in September 1972. It also highlights period approaches in the use of painting as one of the 64 arts necessary for the refined education of urban men and women. So it was quite exciting for us to kind of track these trends across within the archive and to think about the broader arc of art history as well at that time. Two recent volumes that you see on the screen, Molly Aitken's Magic World, published in 2016, and Kavita Singh's Sent Upon a Southern Breeze, published in 2018, discern the distinction between emic and etic terms used to describe the visuality of painted images and the knowledge systems associated with them. Bijapur's 16th and 17th intellectuals, as Catherine Butler Schofield, or rather 17th and 18th century intellectuals, as Catherine Butler Schofield tracks in her essay in this volume, were equally engrossed in the Sanskrit, Persian, and vernacular treatises on musical theory, including the concepts of ajaib, that is Islamic eight wonder, and Sanskritic rasa. She shows that these connoisseurs did not seek one-to-one relations between painted images, recited verses, and performed music in Ragamala paintings. Rather, the affective power of each material medium mattered on its own terms. In this move away from an exclusive search for mimetic renditions of interior human emotions within paintings and towards emotional bonds developed between individuals, we see the work to which these kinds of painted images were put for schooling audiences, for producing sociability, and for transforming yourself into an aesthetic or a pious or a certain kind of a political being. Undergirding this section is an acknowledgement that the ways of seeing and knowing through paintings were always corporeal and tactile, and beyond sight included smell, touch, sound, taste, and perhaps even other sensory registers. Yet, uncomfortable and unpalatable emotions of those on the margins of caste, class, and gender rarely rise to the surface. Which brings us to the questions addressed in the last section on canonization and originality. Numerous non-canonical images featured in the reader's imaginary Chitrashala await your critical engagement. The art historian Neil Rekha's redirection inspires in its tracking of lesser-known local heroes and agricultural laborers painted by Dalit women artists. Two essays by Varunika Saraf and Vishakha Desai cast light on such productions by master miniature painters trained in artist families during the 1950s to the 70s and who produced works for the tourist market, which often landed in museums in India and abroad. They highlight the institution of the Antiquities and Art Treasures Act of 1972, which oversees the export of Indian antiquities and requires the registration of any painting older than 100 years in age. Painting, thus, may be understood to be the product of multiple causes, as gifts, as purchases, as loot. We must ask what Indian painting precludes and the peripheries it recreates. I turn in the end to the words of Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, the leading painter and former professor of art history at MSU Baroda, who writes about encountering Marg's, quote, kaleidoscopic vision of world art from an Asian perspective, close quote. Brimming with rapture and candor, the words you see on the screen, his words uncannily capture where we stand today. How do we reconsider the stakes of learning and writing histories by looking closely and reading and looking widely? Where do we draw the boundaries individually and institutionally of research, response, classification, politicization, and the preservation of art? Thank you.
Thank you, Deepti. But thank you to each one of the editors of the volumes over here. I think it would just not have been possible if they had not brought their experience in dealing with these complex subjects for the kind of diverse audiences in which they've had to teach, and in the complexities of trying to communicate the pressures of knowing, being cognizant of world art history and ways of thinking about art history and visual culture in a short amount of time that is available to us to teach it in the curriculum. There was such a practical component. So actually what happens is that each of these landmark studies and in-depth studies which have been selected for symptomatic reasons, not because they're the only essay that we have on that subject, it's a symptomatic essay, has been given a fantastically articulate preface by the editor. And the guest editor's writings on that evaluates what is the virtue of that particular piece of writing and how you can mobilize and use those images that are there to learn from those pictures that accompany that article. And that's why in some cases, we had to summarize the written word and précis the article, but keep the photographs intact that accompanied it. And one of the great achievements was that all of these margs, which were published in the 40s, 50s, 60s with black and whites, we could contact the image holders for some of them, for a lot of them, in fact, especially for the one on Indian painting, your volume, and reprint them with modern pictures, with modern photography, so that you can actually see the color and the depth of the pictures, which you couldn't do with the original archive, with the original uploaded black and whites from back in the day. So that does make an appreciable difference to the experience of the hard copy now in the reader. Anyway, so thank you.
No, thank you.
Do we have any questions on? Yes, there's a question at the back from Parul.
There's one for Deepti
Huh.
and the other for Naman. Deepti, you talk about double contextualization that you all had to do, you and Gail had to do, about not only present context, but also the original context in which these essays were written. And I was wondering about the term South Asia, because today it's used so indiscriminately. How well does it travel back? Or is there some resistance to it?
You always have to ask the tough questions, Parul, right? So, see, the thing is, I think in the Marg archive itself, you can track it. As far as painting goes, most of the time the terms that were used were Indian painting, Persian painting, Mughal at times. Those were the modes in which it mainly used it in terms of Indian painting, and that's one reason why we actually write about that a little bit in the introduction. It's also, but when we were selecting the articles, we were trying to be very cognizant to be able to bring as much as we can from the peripheries. Or if we weren't able to include, for example, some of the articles from that wonderful first book on Persian painting from the 14th to the 15th century, we really talk about it in terms of what it marks in the historiography and then where it leads scholars to once that material has been published. So in that sense, like that made our decisions in terms of like what we are including of Alchi, what we are introducing. So thinking in terms of geographical markers and also thinking in terms of hierarchical classifications, right? So I'm getting to your point about South Asia. Now, if I speak from my perspective in terms of as teaching in the US, then the concept of South Asia is really timed and is really connected to the Cold War histories, right? And to the making of these South Asia centers in the 1960s and 70s in American universities, and that kind of being tied to a production of the knowledge of the region, right? Again, for instrumental purposes as well. So yeah, I think it's something which is a vex thing, especially for someone like me and Yael as well, that when we are teaching this material in the US, we are thinking about like, are we teaching South Asia and West Asia together? Are we teaching South Asia and the Middle East together? Or in terms of really thinking of histories of painting, bringing West Asia and South Asia and Eurasia together, right? So that being the category that is enabling us to think about questions of mobility, questions of the canon, but that is not necessarily a category that is used or that is deployed by scholars to be talking about Indian painting as a field. So that somewhat answers your question, yeah.
And I mean, it's not a flippant question, Naman, but I also worry about the articles which have not been selected. So what is the status of it in the archive? Do they fall into the dark hole, or
Not at all.
or will it be another occasion when they'll be reworked?
If there is a requirement to, I mean, if there is a need to, I felt that on this occasion to be able to create a handy reader, there were very hard choices, and sometimes we had already gone into such massive compendia that they were already becoming impossible to communicate over a semester and to use as a 3-month or a 5-month, practically to use and go through in a class and so on. But the rest of the Marg archive is entirely available. It's all online. All the other articles are all there, and they're easily searchable. So they are going to be available. But I think the question that you've asked, Dipti, is a much more serious and question that I want to come back to, because it was raised in a different format earlier in the conversation today as well. And it's this business about retrofitting vocabulary. The words that we use today to describe a particular movement or something is not necessarily the vocabulary that they used to use when they wrote about it, and that might have been a pioneering archival study that might have documented a tradition for the first time, but they didn't position it. They knew they were ethically guided while they were doing it, but they didn't use certain words that we today use to categorize the same art practice or that same community. So for instance, the word Harijan is a word that we don't use today, right? But the word Harijan occurs in the body of the material that is used in the Marg archive in the 1950s quite extensively, right? The word South Asia starts appearing more in the archive nowadays. It didn't occur so much in the archive.
Yeah.
You will notice a shift in vocabulary. The word Aryan to describe the history and temple art and architecture, etc., was used even by Mulkraj Anand up until the 60s, right? It was being used as a category, and it stops getting used. After that, it declines in use. So there are things now. One of the other very interesting things is that there are many communities whose practices and rituals are dealt with without calling them marginalized communities, but by giving them their status and just saying these are practitioners. It is such and such practitioner. So when I was looking at, for instance, when Urmimala and Anita were working on that volume on Manipuri, dance teachers and gurus, there were pages and pages of profile pictures, entire contact sheets of the practitioners that who were the great gurus of the Manipuri tradition, that had been given their space without referencing them as some marginalized community or whatever. Now, we can today write about them. Would it be ethical for on our part when we are putting the metadata in for searching these things? Because should I be putting them in categories of marginalized communities? Because that is a subject that you want to address in college today, rather than addressing them as the practitioners that they are with their names. Right? How unethical would it be on my part to label them such? I would be perpetrating a double crime, right, in my modern classification system. So I think that this is not to say that it can't be done in some intelligent way, but there has to be a more enabling discourse by which these things are handled in a more positive way in the nature of categorization. And that does need to be thought through. It is a bit of a tightrope, you know. How do you? So I think sometimes it's better to let the lingo of that time be the lingo of that time, and we can repurpose it and reposition it and give it our preface wherever we
Yeah.
do, and not intervene in that.
Yeah, if I can just quickly respond to that, like in that sense, like I would say that, the Pupuljakar's article that I had mentioned over there, means it's really coming to, the Varley pictographs from a very modernist lens, and at times parts of it are very aggravating to read. So we kind
Right.
of talk about that and contextualize it with some of the latest scholarship in the preface. At the same time, I would say, like in response to what Naman was saying, mixing it up, mixing it up in terms of these themes and topics, to actually mix up those lists that we received in the beginning, is something that I think does a job, or we hope will do the job, of the kind of questioning and reframing and asking new questions of the material. That you can be asking about the question of agency of that painter, named or unnamed, from the 15th century Chandayan, as you can of the Varley pictographs. And here they are in the same section, trying to lay out different methods of getting through the question of artistic agency and historicizing that when you don't have that laid out in text. And
Absolutely.
students can learn that method as much from a 15th century manuscript as they can learn that method from a
wall painting.
1970s Varley painting. So in that sense, I think
I think
that breaching is what we think will
we have done,
make
I
a
think,
difference.
and I think we've done that across the volumes, which is why these volumes are an intervention. Actually, that's the interventionist space of the volumes, because they are not subscribing necessarily to received ways of learning art history. Even,
Other questions? Yes.
please, there's a
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Khera. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Khera, for your riveting talk, and Professor Ahuja and Marg for conceptualizing and putting up this great seminar together. Perhaps I represent the multiple fine arts departments from rural India here, where the practice precedes the theory. And there's a great amount of disdain towards the theory. And one of the reasons which I feel is because, also the problems of pedagogy, we're talking about that today. That's because there's a lack of quality publications in the vernaculars. That creates a great amount of space, so that it kind of excludes the majority of practitioners and students coming from rural India. So since Marg is the leading publisher in the visual arts, would something be happening or
I can-
towards that?
Yeah, I can just respond to this. I'm sure, Naman might have something that Marg has been thinking of. I can just say about something that has come up numerous times in the past 6 months in my conversations with scholars and publishers in India, and also in teaching. In teaching here, especially some immersive teaching that I did at the Rajasthan Bhasha Academy, where there were students from all different universities in the summer. I've been asked, there was some interest with one of my books that would it be translated in Hindi? And that was something that I had to think through very carefully, that who would be the audience in Hindi for a full art history book? How much would it cost? How would the images be published? Who would be reading it in Hindi, kind of a thing? Ultimately, I came to the conclusion in talking to actually colleagues who teach at IGNU, at the Open University, because they have been translating so many articles into the vernacular, that it is more important for short articles from the perspective of method and history. I would say that within schools of practice and within departments that do art and history, there is a certain kind of, both theory and history is not approached in any kind of located way, let's put it that way. So I think that translating articles into Hindi is a great thing, and from that perspective, I think it's really worth evaluating if the readers should be translated into a vernacular. I don't know. You can,
Thanks.
yeah.
Yeah, that's very optimistic. I think, no, I mean that very seriously. It was one of my great ambitions to be able to do so. It remains that. Marg is going to be putting out its first 2 volumes. The current publication of the Chandayan, for instance, was a massive learning curve for the editorial team to be able to publish bilingually in Nagari and Roman simultaneously, and to have proofreaders for 16th century Jaunpuri Avdhi. And to be able to read that kind of lingo, it required very specialized proofreading and those kinds of things, because when you're dealing with art history, it's not just a matter of dealing with the contemporary language, but to be able to deal with the historical language as well. So yeah, there are challenges. The book on the great temple of Tanjore is being published in Tamil now.
Great.
And so it's being translated. It's George Michel and Indira Peterson's book that is going to go into translation now. So that is happening. But I think there are some other books that are on the anvil that we have selected, which would be more germane and appropriate, small-sized format, still very well illustrated, that should be translated. As Dipti was saying, we had been assessing how to go about it. And I think the point as a publisher to enter into something like this is not to do it as a one-off, but to have periodicity and regularity in publishing in that field if you want to develop a readership and vocabulary for your subject. It can't be just one book that you produce. And so it requires a certain kind of an institutional commitment to be able to do this. And that's not been an easy one to get. But we are certainly working on this. This is a major matter. The other thing that's happened is that some of our big challenge in doing this is that artificial intelligence and Google Translate are getting better and better. And with the entire Marg archive that has come online, we are going to find that a lot of it is accessible in regional languages because we don't have to do that. It's going to get done automatically on Google. And just as our students are accessing a lot of articles written originally in French and German without having to know French and German, but are able to access them via Google Translate for at least a first read, ditto with all the Marg archive now going into Indian languages. So
But that will change from every AI answer. It is different. So everybody will be reading a different thing.
yes, it doesn't. Of course, an official and a proper translation is a official and a proper translation. No question about the one. It doesn't replace the other, certainly. But there are things that are happening beyond our control now. That's taking place out there. Are there any other issues or questions that you'd like to raise? Well, I have to say in conclusion, in that case, I want to really thank you all very much. Your support really means a lot. I don't think that this ship could be steered without a really strong editorial support team and everyone else who works at Marg to make this happen. My colleagues have really gone above and beyond, and I know many of them have been exhausted absolutely by the sheer effort of having to go through this entire archive and see what needs to be done and assess this entire matter about where we stand with art publishing in India, and what we can do with art publishing in India. I hope the public will respond. I hope policymakers, I hope our trustees at Marg itself will understand, and I hope we can continue to contribute in some way to the industry. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deepthi and Naman. I'd just quickly like to thank all of you for being here. I mean, it's been a long day, and so really thank you. And I have to also thank all the people who've made it possible for us to put out these readers. The readers would not have been possible without TVS Motor Company, Harish and Beena Shah Foundation, Arumugam Supaya, Jamshed and Firoza Godrej, JK Paper Limited, Hikal Limited, PNP Paribas, Lafair Designs Private Limited, NCPA, Narottam Seksaria Foundation, Kiran Nadar Museum of Art, Pandols, and the Gujral Foundation. So yeah, thank you all for coming out and maybe keep connecting over margs that happen in the future. Thank you.